we've got a full committee roster. I think Mr. Turner indicated he might join, so I'll watch for that as well. Kenneth, did you need me to send the annotated, or are you good?
No, I'll be good.
You're good? Okay. Yeah, so it's up to you when you want to get started.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Are we
Yep. And you're good to go.
Excellent. All right, well, I want to welcome everybody this Thursday night at 6:03 p.m. and welcome to the NVTC WMATA committee meeting. We're starting at 6:03 p.m. And I'd like to remind everyone that due to the current pandemic, we are still currently meeting electronically. And this is possible because of the governor and state legislature allowing us to still conduct business statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of our public body. NVTC staff also follow the procedures and guidelines in the legislation to give notice to the WMATA committee, commission staff, and the public. Just want to remind everyone, please stay on mute if you're not actively speaking to cut down on background noise, and one, for note-taking purposes, and two, for the public, if you could identify yourself when you begin to speak and come off mute. And the only visual component of the meeting is going to be the presentation slides shown on WebEx for WMATA committee members and on the YouTube live stream for the public. So I think, Mr. DeVetter, I think we're ready for the roll.
Excellent. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please respond here when you hear your name. Mr. Alcorn.
Here.
Mr. DeFerenti.
Here.
Mr. Letourneau.
Here.
Mr. Meyer.
Here.
Mr. Smedberg.
Here.
And Mr. Schneider.
Here.
And as a reminder, NVTC bylaws allow for any commissioner to attend, and I see Ms. Garvey.
Yep, I'm just visiting. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for coming. And did Mr. Turner join yet? Anyone that I missed? All right, thank you. We have a quorum. I'll now identify staff and include their titles for the benefit of the listening public. We have Executive Director Kate Mattice. I am WMATA Program Manager Andrew DeVetter. On with us as well, we have Program Analyst Zach Smith, Web and IT Manager Melissa Walker, and Greg Potts of WMATA Government Relations is also on as well. I will turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you. And we already went over the requirements for an electronic meeting. So just want to check to see if we received any public comments.
We did not receive any comments.
Thank you. As always, would like to acknowledge the rest of the NVTC staff who are working behind the scenes to make this meeting possible. We all recognize without this technology, we wouldn't be able to meet in the first place. So thank you to everyone that's been able to make this possible. Taking a look at our agenda, we're going to go ahead and jump to the first agenda item, which will be to review the October 29th committee meeting summary. Were there any comments or concerns with our committee meeting summary?
Move approval.
So fortunately, we don't have to
Right.
do approval, but I like you going after it, Mr. DeFerenti. Gonna give 10 quick seconds if there's anybody that's got any comments, and then we'll go ahead and move on. Okay, looks like we're good with our committee meeting summary. Moving on to agenda item number 2, it's going to be the NVTC WMATA committee orientation and schedule. This is the committee's first meeting of the year, which is generally when new committee members receive an orientation on the WMATA committee and its role within NVTC. However, there are no new commissioners joining the WMATA committee this year, but staff has prepared a brief refresher to reacquaint our existing members to the committee and provide a brief outline of upcoming activities within the coming year, which personally I always feel is good to have a refresher. In the past year, this committee has worked collaboratively to make sure that Virginia speaks with one voice on WMATA-related matters, and the proposed schedule for 2021 is meant to maintain the momentum. However, the committee's schedule may change if the committee needs to respond to any unscheduled or unplanned initiatives or activities at WMATA, i.e. maybe we get a large tranche of money again. But Andrew, I'm going to turn this back over to you so we could have a brief presentation.
Absolutely, thank you. So this is, as the chairman said, this agenda item is something that we review every year with the committee, and while the committee membership is the same, we do have a few new faces in the virtual room and wanted to take the opportunity to review committee scope and schedule. Next slide, Zach. For the overview and scope for the committee, we want to remind committee members that NVTC's governance and coordination role with WMATA takes place and fits within a number of different levels and processes as shown on the slide. The committee sits in the middle here, and the committee was created by the Commission in response to the 2018 legislation in Virginia, which enacted dedicated capital funding and included other reforms for WMATA. The committee's role is established in NVTC's bylaws and consistent with two primary responsibilities as shown on the screen. The first is providing a forum for consensus-based recommendations to the Commission on WMATA policy positions and providing strategic guidance to staff on WMATA-related matters that come out of NVTC's legislative responsibilities, primarily the annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. On the left, within this framework, you can see the Commission receives monthly reports from the Virginia members of the WMATA board and has a robust discussion as we've all seen, and reports from the committee chair. The commission will take formal action often on things that are deliberated at this committee, especially letters of comment, which is something we'll get to later in the agenda. And lastly, there's a regional staff structure that meets quite frequently. NVTC coordinates calls with jurisdictional staff and WMATA board members to prepare all parties for WMATA board meetings, and this helps us build consensus and facilitate multi-jurisdictional representation from NVTC's members of the WMATA board. Next slide, Zach. This slide here shows our draft schedule for the year. We envision approximately 5 to 6 committee meetings spread throughout the year at key times. Major topics for the committee include our standard 2 topics, which are comments on the budget, which seems to be an ongoing topic with COVID-19, as well as work sessions on the annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. This year, we've also included the companion report to last year's commission report on Virginia's 3% cap on WMATA, which is a carryover activity from the 3% working group, as well as the commission's discussion on that topic from last year. We've also included a number of items identified for committee discussion, but we don't quite know where they go on the schedule yet, and that is namely the Blue, Orange, and Silver Line capacity and reliability study, which is being undertaken by WMATA, and any future budget changes due to COVID, which is obviously a moving target. Those are areas where either current committee members or past committee members have indicated they want to weigh in on, and so those are sort of placeholders which will fit into the schedule as we can. At present, we are targeting the next committee meeting for May, but this is something that we'll work with the chair on and try to get that information out at least a few months ahead if possible. So with that, I will turn it over to the chair for any comments or questions.
Thank you, Andrew. This is always helpful to go over just to make sure that we are keeping ourselves on track as well. But are there any commissioners that had any questions or comments? All right. Looking good then. I guess we're ready to get into the meat of our conversation and jump on over to agenda item number 3, and which is discussion and comments on WMATA's FY 2022 proposed operating and capital budget. Tonight, the committee will hear a presentation and discuss comments on the WMATA GM/CEO's proposed FY 2022 operating and capital budget. The full commission will continue to discuss comments on the proposed budget at the February meeting. Staff will then draft a letter of comments of the budget for commission action at the March meeting. All right, and Mr. DeVetter, I think I'm going to throw this back over to you.
Thank you. Next slide, Zach. So as we dive in, since we last spoke on WMATA's budget at the December commission meeting, Congress passed the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or the Relief Act, before the new year. WMATA currently estimates, and this is a preliminary estimate, receiving approximately $610 million from the Relief Act. And last week, the WMATA board approved using $95.6 million of that to close the FY21 funding gap, which would prevent the need for layoffs for fiscal 21. And the general manager proposes using the remainder, $514 million, to offset a projected budget gap of $724 million for fiscal 2022. So the key take-home message here is that the aid obviously helps, but it does not quite close the budget gap in fiscal 22. Last week as well, the WMATA board authorized revisions to the proposed budget that would go out for public hearing. And those changes do reflect the integrating the Relief Act into the proposal. Next slide. As I mentioned, the current funding gap is $209.8 million. And again, the take-home messages here are that revenues at WMATA are down because ridership is down, and especially on rail, which is a key fare revenue driver for the agency. After the expenses are also slightly up, and then once the subsidy is applied, as well as the remaining CARES Act fund, that leaves that $209 million gap, which will be a primary discussion point as we get into the fiscal 22 budget. Next slide, Zach. That gap is proposed to be solved by the general manager's proposals that are shown on the screen. And so there's a number of different components that help close that gap. WMATA is required to have a balanced budget. The first item here is management actions to reduce the gap. This is a mix of initiatives, but two to note are deferring salary increases for represented and non-represented personnel, and as well as several other items, which totals $58 million. Service reductions, which are the primary driver here on rail and bus, and we'll get to those a little later in the presentation, but those would start in the latter half of fiscal 2022. And then lastly here, and this is just something that's sort of in the mix that yields this number, is that there are some additional costs that are placeholder for Title VI adjustments related to Silverline Phase 2, and that's something that I think the board will know more about in the coming months. And these are the proposals that play to close the gap. Next slide, Zach. There's some other key highlights in the budget, which are worth noting for the committee. The first here is that this proposed budget does forego the 3% subsidy growth. So when we discussed this in December, the 3% growth was included, so it's currently not in the proposed budget. It is important to note that there are legislative exclusions that do obviously have a monetary component here, which are included in the proposed subsidy, but the 3% piece is what is foregone. The budget does currently assume Silverline Phase 2 revenue service beginning in July of 2021, and this proposal that is before us does not shift any additional operating expenses to the capital program for preventive maintenance, which is something that was discussed last month. This proposal also includes an estimated $108 million of additional coronavirus relief aid for local bus operators. This is very similar to what was done in the first, or in the CARES Act, or the first Relief Act. We don't know much more than this, and there will be lots of conversations both at staff level and other levels in the coming weeks as WMATA sort of develops this further, gets guidance from FTA, et cetera. So obviously it's good to have in there, but a lot more information to come on that. Next slide, Zach. This is an overview of the Metro Rail service changes. So essentially, first half of the year, Metro Rail would be maintained at 80% of pre-pandemic levels, which is more or less what is being provided now, or at least what will be provided at the end of fiscal 21. And then essentially, we hit that aid running out cliff for the last half of fiscal 22. And then you see pretty significant service reductions here, 30% of pre-pandemic levels. 22 stations would be closed. There would be turnbacks, obviously increased frequencies here of 30 minutes and earlier closings. And then cost savings would be achieved through FTE reductions. Next slide, Zach. And a similar story for bus, where current levels, which will actually be a little improved, will be maintained until the end of the calendar year. at about 82% of pre-pandemic levels, and then they would drop to about 50% of pre-pandemic levels, with significant consolidations and reductions of service across the region. And again, cost savings will be achieved through FTE reductions as shown. Next slide, Zach. So before we jump into the comment and discussion part of the agenda this evening, I do want to pause and I think reiterate some of the comments that Chair Gure had mentioned, that tonight is obviously discussion as an information item. We envision a similar continued discussion at the February Commission meeting with an opportunity to make any additional comments or discussion, and then we'll work with the chairman on working that into a letter or seeking an action at the March Commission meeting, where we would authorize a letter to be sent, which would further articulate those comments. So there's a couple more opportunities to make comments here. I guess my take-home message for this slide, and I do also want to remind everyone that we have invited the general manager, and he is scheduled to attend the March Commission meeting as well, where he will provide remarks. Next slide, Zach. So these 5 bullet points at present are staff's recommended themes to include in comments, which would eventually become a letter on the proposed FY 2022 budget. Because the budget is delayed, we're still pretty early, so there's obviously some areas which will develop. But first, I think this first theme here is to open up the Silver Line Phase 2 as soon as possible with full service to all stations. And then second, avoid or minimize shifting operating expenses to the capital program for preventive maintenance, which would then maintain our state of good repair capital program and preserve dedicated funding debt capacity, preserving that sufficient level of Metro Rail and Metro Bus service to serve essential workers and position the region for quick economic recovery, continuing to seek additional federal support to avoid layouts and close that budget gap. And then lastly, continuing to communicate and encourage a safe return to transit to rebuild ridership, as farebox recovery is key to bringing WMATA's revenues up and having a sustainable financial situation. Next slide, Zach. So at this point, we have 2 discussion questions before the committee. The first is essentially, did we get these right up top? And then second is there anything you'd like to add, anything that's missing? And what we'll do is take copious notes and work the content of this discussion into Chair Aguirre's remarks to the Commission at the February meeting. So with that, I will pause and I will turn it back to the Chair to get us started on the discussion.
Thank you, Andrew. And real fast, I just wanted to provide a moment if there's any other NVTC staff that wanted to make any quick comments or anything. All right, no problem. So for our committee, we essentially have 2 questions in front of us right now, right? Number 1, do we support the recommended themes to include in the comments? And number 2, if there's any additional themes that anyone feels that we should include. So going to go ahead and open it up to our committee members. Mr. Snyder.
Thanks very much. So I appreciate the presentation and the difficult issues that we're all trying to deal with. I would like to add 2 additional comments: that the proposed closure of 29 stations and a headway of 30 minutes is simply not acceptable. Frankly, and I'll get local and then go regional for a minute. If that's the level of service we get from Metro, I don't see paying Metro a dime for it. So to be harsh about it, I appreciated that sort of meat cleaver approach to the budget. It had to be done quickly. We were in a political context where we needed to lay out a worst case. But I have to tell you, the second part of FY 22, I don't care what the funding situation is not an acceptable situation. It's got to be much more nuanced than that. The hours have to be adjusted differently. You should keep some stations open, at least theoretically open. And a headway of 30 minutes is like not having a rail system at all. So I would just like us to add something along the lines of express, great concern about some of the proposals for the second half of FY 22, including closure of stations and very long headways. if that would be agreeable to folks. The rest of it I agree with, but my priorities might be different, but I want it, as long as our comments are included, I'm fine with the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder, and really good point, right? If we're talking about economic rebound and we're closing most of the stations, and what's the point, right? Mr. Alcorn, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions, and I support the themes, and I appreciate Mr. Snyder's comments too. A couple of questions about the budget, and Andrew, I don't know if this is for you or who, but there is a $20 million equity improvements penalty, I guess, with the opening of Phase 2 Silver Line, and I know that's a preliminary estimate at this point, but you know, I mean, I know that at least the Fairfax County part of very well, and you know, less than a mile or probably about a half mile from the innovation station is Hutchinson Elementary School, which is a Title I school, 94% minority population. So, and I know in Reston, you know, we you know, close to the Reston Town Center station that's going to open, we also have quite a diverse population. So I guess my question is that right? I'm just struggling with that number.
You want me to take that one, Andrew?
Go ahead,
Matt, where is that? Where is that study? Because I just don't believe it.
We don't have the study yet. So, I mean, I know you and I talked about this. So that is a preliminary estimate of what they think the Title VI analysis is going to show. The challenge with the equity analysis is that it has to be done within 6 months of the service being started, or they have to redo it and the service has to stop while they figure that out. So they can't actually do the report yet because we don't have a start date for Phase 2. They have done sort of some high level, you know, analysis of it, and that's where it came out. I have asked to see more details that explain sort of why it came out that way and get more to your question. In fact, I even kind of brought up our conversations about it and told staff that they're going to need to explain to the folks that represent those areas exactly how that came out and why. So I think they told me they would be prepared to do that, but they weren't ready to yet. So the $20 million that's in that budget right now is sort of a placeholder. It's not a refined number. It's sort of, I think, a worst case scenario in terms of the budgetary impacts that will probably be adjusted as we get further into them actually doing the analysis.
All right, I look forward to that. Thank you, Matt. So my other question is, and I may have missed it, but in looking through the WMATA, the Financial and Capital Committee documents, I didn't see a chart showing rail ridership and what the assumptions are for FY22. What are the assumptions going in? Because that's going to be such a, and I like our last bullet here, continue to communicate and encourage a safe return to transit to rebuild ridership. But how conservative or aggressive are we being in terms of assuming return to rail? Does anybody know?
Walter.
Yeah, Paul.
Go ahead,
Go ahead,
Paul.
man.
No, go ahead.
I mean, it's a fairly conservative to mid-range estimate. Is that fair, Matt? I think that's a fair assumption. There is no exact study or anything, Walter. This is just based on what they're hearing from the federal government, major employers, associations, all the groups that they are in regular contact with. So it's really hard to say.
So just actually, there was a question that came on this today. So as of July 1, 21, so the beginning of the fiscal year, their estimates are assuming 34% ridership on the Silver Line Phase 2, which is consistent with the overall system. So that is, significantly higher than it is right now. Then throughout the fiscal year, and I don't have the exact matrix, but they have added in ridership at sort of a steady level, assuming that it comes back.
And would you remember what they're topping out at by December, I guess?
I don't remember exactly.
And then I would assume then they're showing a drop, right? Starting in January with reduced service?
No, because it's a demand model, not really,
it's one of those. Yeah, got it.
Well, I mean, I think, so I was going to make some comments in a second to maybe frame this a little differently.
Why don't we start now, Matt? Let's do that now.
Yeah,
that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe, I think we kind of, so the December, the January timeframe stuff, and Paul, feel free to jump in here. This is obviously the sort of the worst case of what happens. There is this philosophical question, and I don't want to do a lot of talking on this because we want to hear from all of you about whether Metro is better off essentially applying all the money as was outlined in that presentation now, or being in a situation where we would do enhanced layoffs starting in July. Not to the doomsday level, but some layoffs and some service reductions, but would not run out of money in January. To Dave's point, I think we would all agree that level of service is not acceptable. Whether or not that can be manipulated in the budget, to sort of prevent some of that, I don't know. I think the reality is that's the type of cut that would be needed in January if more money isn't coming in. So, the alternative to that is Metro doesn't apply all the federal funding at once and instead makes layoffs and service reductions in July. And I think what the general manager would say, and what he did say with his recommendation is, with the money that was provided by Congress, there's sort of an assumption that is being used to prevent layoffs. And so we're kind of in a little bit of a situation there, because if we were to take the money and then lay a bunch of people off and cut service anyway, that may raise some questions. On the other hand, if we don't do that, we will run out of the money and then we will have this issue. So that is kind of the big picture item that I think we need some guidance on. And again, it's probably something that's strategic based on what we think a new administration in Congress is going to do and what the likelihood is of getting aid for transit, additional aid for transit that'll kick in at some point during the year. But I think that's kind of the question, really. It's not so much the specifics of what happens in January, because if we think that that's going to happen, then that's probably not what we should be doing anyway, this approach.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask Matt a question?
Yeah. Go ahead, Mr.
Real quick. Thank you. So Matt, I know the other big variable here is additional federal funds. So, are we going to get, anything out of that? So how much, it's really more of a question. I'm just wondering how much that should play into our thinking.
A lot. I think this scenario that is the general manager's recommendation is essentially gambling on getting more federal funds by the end of January. And it is taking a similar tack to what happened in 21, in which we are essentially saying, if we don't, this is what will happen. And I think that storyline would be repeated throughout transit systems across the country, who are going to do the same thing that the general manager is recommending, which is to apply the funds, and then that's going to get you through a certain period. And that's the same approach that the airline industry is taking. They aren't, they're bringing people back because they're getting money, but they will run out of it again. And so then there's the question, and they could smooth it out more, but I think that plays a major role in whether this is the approach that we should take or not, is sort of that question as to whether we're going to get more federal funds or not.
Yeah, because I mean, just right off the top of my head, I'm thinking, if there's a good likelihood we could get more federal funds, then yeah, we definitely should avoid laying people off. The one thing I am wondering though is, you know, this is going to take a couple of years to get out of this, you know, and are there some things that are maybe more, I would say, intermediate period right sizing that need to happen that could save, you know, that maybe do need to kick in earlier, sooner rather than later, and could at least bring down some of the deficit.
Well, there are some things that Paul has already initiated. The general manager has already worked in. They've got various studies underway now, looking at 2-3 years. Not more. The current bill that the president, I guess, producer will, has $20 billion in it for transit, but that's not guaranteed. I was on a call with Mark Warner. Just the transit is going to be another heavy lift, given everything. So, I think that there's a conversation, but there is definitely efforts going on with the general manager right now as to what model will look like in the future. And there's been several folks who have taken early retirement, and other, they're looking at consolidating offices and efficiencies and all kinds of things, to streamline the organization.
Real fast, I think, Mr. DeFerranti, are you trying to get in here?
Yeah, I support, I appreciate the discussion. I support Mr. Snyder's amendments. I guess my question is, on slide 11, I certainly think that layoffs now or severe cuts now doesn't seem, it seems to be compounding an economic contraction with less spending. So I guess I'm a little interested in the rail service levels that we're estimating at 30% in January to June. I guess I kind of am thinking, what about a strategy that is hoping for federal funding and doing a little bit of what the airlines are doing, but being a little bit, at least 30% after 80% doesn't seem likely to me. So am I reading that right?
So that's what would be provided with the level of funding that would be remaining in January. Not right to ship, but that's the level to be provided. And if the goal there was to have a higher level of service, then on the left side, that number would need to come down. And we would need to provide 50 or 60 or 70% in this July to December period. You would see some FTE reductions in that first 6 months in order to bring the number on the right up. Again, sure. That's a federal kind of infusion. So,
yeah. So, and you guys have both, just to follow up, you both have looked at the projections for ridership, and you think that they're, reasonable. Thank you for clarifying what the service level is, but you think that for 22, the assumptions are neither optimistic nor pessimistic too much.
Well, I think they're conservative, but I think they have to be conservative, from a budgeting standpoint, because if you miss on that and you're too high, then you've created a big problem for yourself. It's easier to add service back than it is to cut it. So I think they are conservative. I mean, I have a lot of, obviously, the stuff on the right, those rail stations that are closing, aside from the 19, those also include now a bunch of new phase 2 stations. And so, one of the immediate questions is, well, you're going to open phase 2 in, say it's October, and then you're going to close a bunch of stations 2 months later. Does that make sense? No, of course it doesn't make sense. So again, I think this question comes down to how likely are we to get federal funding or not? And if we are not willing to gamble on that, then we probably need to do some service reductions in July in order to be able to smooth this out. But I think there's so many unknowns on the demand side that, you know, I think we will get into this topic more during the budget process and what we actually expect for ridership, but that's evolving, you know, so new administration coming in, federal workforce is a big factor in metro ridership. You know, we don't know how they'll approach it and so on. There's so many things there that it's hard for me to kind of pick it apart because, you know, there's no playbook for this.
Right. There is a playbook, and it isn't so much about numbers right now, Matt, as it is, I think, timing is more of an issue.
Yeah.
You know, trying to guesstimate when people are going to come back. I mean, everything we're hearing from folks is it's more likely September timeframe than it is July.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and a board member who thinks, you know, things are going to roar back in. I personally don't think that's realistic, but you know, I think more realistic is something along the September timeframe. So that's it. I mean, it's more an issue of timing than the actual percent.
You were looking for direction overall, and I think I agree with the need for conservative, and I don't think everyone will be back in July, but at least my 2 cents is I would plan a little more for the federal money coming in, but then, you know, I think that Mr. Snyder's suggestions are good regardless, unless you guys tell us that, you know, those additions wouldn't be, you know, there's any concerns with those additions.
Well, one note of caution with this next tranche of potential money, it may not be just a outright allocation of funds. It'd be tied to, okay, we're going to give you, you know, $10 million to buy buses. We're going to give you $10 million to buy rail cars. We're going to give you $10 million to do track upgrades or similar. Actual tranche of money per se. It may be tied to specific capital or state of good repair, infrastructure projects.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't have a concern about that language, and I think it's sort of obvious. I agree with it. It's just the question back will be, okay, and what do you want us to do? Do you want us to cut now so that we don't do that? You know what I mean? Like it's you know, I mean, obviously nobody wants 30-minute headways. So the other thing I'll say is, in addition to this transit money, the other factor is there is potentially money for state and local governments coming. You know, I've heard 350 thrown around as the number. So, you know, would we as jurisdictions be in a position to, you know, enhance our WMATA contribution to avoid some of these service cuts if the money came, you know, in at some point during the course of the year? I don't know. You know, I'm not suggesting that we are. I'm just throwing it out there as another potential source of money. So.
Can we jump back to Mr. Snyder and then Mr. Alcorn? Did you have another question? Yeah, let's go Mr. Snyder and then Mr. Alcorn.
Sure. So thanks a lot. I am concerned about sort of spending at a high level, then dropping down to practically nothing and hoping for a federal bailout. I would favor a much more level glide path, and that may mean not going at the service levels you're talking about for July through September. And it may mean going up to 15-minute headways. It may mean cutting back Saturday and Sunday service. It may mean closing at 10 p.m. as opposed to 11 p.m. But I would not recommend that you spend all your money and then face a doomsday scenario and hope that the federal government is going to bail us out, because at some point the federal government is going to stop doing that. So I favor a much more level glide path. We make some cuts now. We maybe don't get to the 80% pre-pandemic levels. I don't know what the number would be, 70%, 65%, and then be able to maintain a lower level of service but not this doomsday scenario. So it's sort of odd to me that you spend a huge amount of money mid-year, you just assume, you know, and you spend all your money, and then you're left basically with nothing to spend, and you hope for a federal bailout. To me, that kind of peak and valley approach is not a good one. I wouldn't do it personally. I wouldn't recommend my city do it, and I sure don't recommend that Metro do it.
Well, if any of us, you know, I don't think any of us would do it. But Dave, I think there's also some level of expectation that goes along with this and for and what it's not to be used for. So, and as you know, any agency like this and your own local government and everything, you know, the HR related, you know, keeping people employed, which is an expectation, and everything costs money.
I guess ultimately, you know, as much as I want to maintain employment, I think our number one objective is the service that we're providing that matches the money that we have to provide it. So I appreciate all these other goals and objectives, which I totally share, but to me, it seems skewed. You don't have a level of demand to justify the level that you're talking about in July and December. We hope that it'll go up, but it's not going to be 80% of pre-pandemic demand. So I think we need to do a better nuanced job of matching service to demand, avoiding and stretching out the money to some extent and avoiding this sort of doomsday scenario for the second half of 2022, because I honestly don't know whether the federal government's going to come to the rescue again.
Yeah, and that's exactly kind of what I was saying. So good feedback. I think the only other factor that I know the general manager would say to us is, if you are planning for, if we do get the money and we're going to start service back, then you've let a bunch of people go, and you can't just necessarily turn around on a dime and bring them back to get back to your level of service. They've got concerns on workforce. There are obviously some positions that aren't skilled, trained positions necessarily, but you'd be getting rid of rail operators here, for instance, and you can't necessarily just bring them right back. So it will delay your ability to do that, and they've got to go through training again and all that kind of stuff. So I think one group of conversations that we need to have, if that's the approach that the Metro board takes, is with our congressional delegation, because beyond, I know the chairman's certainly been doing that, but as he kind of alluded to, there's an expectation with us getting this money that we're not going to lay anybody off. And so I want to go back and say and present this as we have, why we would do that in order to try to be conservative. And I'm not, at this point in time, I'm kind of personally on the fence on this. I want to hear everybody's opinion and sort of see how it develops. And it's possible by the time we have to vote on this in March that there's some firm indicators from Congress and the administration, one way or the other, that may sway us. But my reaction, Dave, was kind of similar to yours overall. So I get where you're coming from.
And I too understand you.
Hey, Mr. Alcorn, Mr. Meyer's trying to get in. Do you mind letting him, since he hasn't had a chance
no,
to speak
please
yet?
go ahead.
No. Mr. Meyer, please.
Could you go back to, I think it was slide 15 or 16 that had the five points on it? Let me begin by saying I agree that we're not going to be seeing a substantive change in our current circumstance until September. And I think one of the big drivers will be whether or not the local schools in the region reopen. And when they do, that's going to change the decision matrix with respect to individuals, whether they continue to work at home or they go back, or at least a portion of them go back to work outside of the home. And that's going to affect the demand for Metro to some extent, not completely. But I don't see a significant change between now and the 1st of September. And there's other drivers as well, but I think the school reopenings is a significant portion of it. since you're asking for input, I think that some of it, what we're struggling with is what I've called in the past the tyranny of the moment. And I want us to remember going back to 2017 and 18, when the state of good repair was really first and foremost on our minds. And those systems and structures of the metro system itself are not getting any younger every 6 months that goes by with respect to whether we're operating at full capacity or not. And secondly, that the cost of those, if we were to delay some of those, the cost of that is only going to go up. And this is where I'm really struggling with the second bullet. I think that I would like to see us strike the words "or minimize" and just say avoid shifting any operating expenses to the capital program. This is the slippery slope that got us into this position before 2016. And it started way back 20 years ago when they kept delaying and putting off capital improvements and maintenance. And we got ourselves into a multi-billion-dollar hole. And the agreements that we struck with both Virginia and Maryland were, in fact, to make this capital investment to keep this system in the state of good repair. And I don't want to, I personally am really troubled by us sort of having a little bit of temporary amnesia. And I'm not suggesting anybody on this meeting is having that, but people simply, I don't want to be, we don't want to lay off workers. We don't want to cut service. And I agree with Dave Snyder that we ought to have a more controlled slide down, and so then we can have a controlled slide back. I get it. I understand the cost of letting people go, but this is a very difficult decision matrix. But I'm very, very concerned about bullet number 2, and I would like to have a firewall between operating expenses and the capital program. Irrespective of whether or not what Paul says might happen, which we can't control, whether there would be actually designated pots of money that we would be able to spend it on, or we'd be prohibited from spending any additional monies. So those are my initial thoughts at this point. But I do recognize how difficult this is.
Dave, I think, well, I personally agree with you, and I can say that Matt agrees with you as well. He is particularly vocal on this during his exchanges with other members and the general manager. I agree with you already. I mean, we're going to have, good likelihood we're going to have at least 4 new members here soon. And so, there you go. And you've seen it. You've been in the elective office long enough where everyone raids the capital budget, or will just put off this project or put off that project because they don't want to make tough decisions about the real budget issues, which are always on the operating side. So, and it did. That's how it started. No, we'll just do it 1 year, and 1 year became 2 years, and 2 years became 3 years. And that is exactly what happened. And I know that's a concern of mine. And if we look at the history over the past 4 or 5 years, the reason got dedicated funds and the reason why PREA is, we'll get some PREA money here again, is because of the commitment to the state of good repair, to infrastructure, and maintaining a good system. And we definitely do not want to go back, backwards, because if we do, all the gains that we've made in the last 2-3 years, will be for naught, really. Because like you said, there's still a lot of the system we have to attend to. We're still working through items from FTA and other groups, the Safety Commission. There's still a lot of work to do.
Just to get a quick poll of the room with what we're just discussing right now, Mr. Snyder, Mr. DeFerranti, Mr. Alcorn, are you kind of in line with that we could, for bullet number 2, tighten up some of the language on it?
I would prefer that it stay avoid or minimize. I mean, I agree with what everybody's saying, but that's such a you know, and I don't want this to be easy, but frankly, that's a really big line item, and I fear that, you know, we're going to end up with such service reductions. We're going to, you know, potentially be doing long-term damage to the system if we end up with some of the, you know, the currently proposed second half service reductions. And granted, I'm thinking probably more about the silver line than anywhere else, but I do worry that being too strong on that basically could be self-defeating in the long run. Mr.
DeFranchi, some thoughts?
I agree with Mr. Alcorn on that, and grant that Mr. Letourneau and Mr. Paul, both of your concerns, I haven't gotten to live the pain that you've been going through the last couple of years, but I guess I feel like we're in a better spot than we have been in as far as discipline, and I also feel like I could probably use some education about, you know, this is the contraction's probably on the level of the Great Recession. So, you know, I would stick with the language we have.
Mr. Snyder, did you want to make any comments on that one? You're on mute.
It's only the 6th web call today. You'd think I would have figured it out by now. I kind of side with Mayor Meyer on this. I think we need a pretty strong statement, and maybe stronger than we've got it, avoid or minimize. But the reality is if we need to shift a small amount of operating expenses to the capital program, you know, so be it. But I think as a go-in principle, I think avoiding makes a somewhat stronger statement.
See, can I ask Paul and Matt? I'm kind of with you guys in terms of not wanting to go in that direction at all, but I also don't want to take out a potential tool, right? So, I mean,
yeah. So
go ahead,
Matt.
No, I was gonna say. So I think we get the message. I think one thing that we could do is kind of a compromise between these two positions is sort of spell out in more detail the concerns we have and why we have them about the impact to the capital budget. Nobody wants to hear me whine, so I won't do much of it. But I've taken a lot of grief over this particular issue because not some of the other board members don't agree that this is a concern at all. And so originally, you know, the general manager had basically been considering shifting 160 million over and solving most of this gap, which is, as you know, the chairman said, a very easy, clean way to do it, except it is very poor financial policy and fiscal management, and you have to start looking long term. And I kind of stumbled upon some concerns that are outside of this particular conversation about Metro's debt planning and the way that Metro plans to issue debt and the lack of a real schedule on how they're doing it and when they're doing it. Because I wanted to try to demonstrate what the implications would be of losing that debt capacity in the future and, you know, getting into the state of good repair projects that we suddenly wouldn't be able to issue debt for. And so those are separate things that we're dealing with on the capital budget, but I don't know. I mean, I think we get the message. There's always some amount of shifting that goes on, even in a normal budget year. So completely, you know, not having any is probably too strong a stance to take. But I think if we kept avoid or, you know, minimize to the greatest extent possible, maybe, and then maybe added some, you know, a little bit of an explanation about what our concern is there, it would be helpful, because I was trying to convey in these conversations that this wasn't just my personal opinion, that, you know, there are others that Paul and I had consulted, colleagues and those in state government. And, you know, I even consulted with, you know, I'm the chairman of our finance committee in Loudoun, and I even consulted with our debt folks who I work with when we go out and do our credit rating trips and bond sales and so on. And, you know, that was sort of formulating our opinion. In Richmond, there's an expectation that the money that they put forward for that dedicated funding is being used for certain purposes, and I don't think it was for preventive maintenance. So I don't want to jeopardize that. So I think maybe if we kind of just beefed up that language a little, but kept the word minimize, but then added to the greatest extent. Maybe that's an acceptable compromise.
Well, let me say this, because we're going to have a couple of opportunities to discuss this. Potentially, staff, can you guys come up with a couple of options for language, and then we could, come back to this and see if people feel comfortable. And Mr. Alcorn, I want to go back to you, and then after you, if I could go to Mr. Turner.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and very good discussion. And also, thank you, Matt and Paul, for doing this. Really appreciate it. One question, Paul, you had mentioned earlier about the timing, and I think you're so right. We don't know when people are going to come back, but I guess consistent with the last bullet, is there something more we need to be talking about and thinking about in terms of being much more aggressive in trying to get people back onto Metro Rail? Is there something we can do on the more on the promotional side? Maybe something jointly. I know there are plans, but maybe we can move the needle just a little bit in terms of ridership. I know we don't control the federal government, but with all the other Metro Rail trips that are taking, it seems to me that we might be able, with some concerted effort, work with major employers on giving back, have a coordinated return to work, return to rail, program wherever it makes sense. I guess I'm wondering if we might be able to move that positive.
Yeah, some of those discussions are already taking place. Employer initiated and WMATA initiated, as they've been beginning to talk to, or as they've been talking to folks. Any number of suggestions come forward during our discussions. I think one of the big things is, and Matt has had an idea of his own, and there are numerous others out there. Fair say, and I know it's one issue that I have to, obviously with everything we've put all the strategy stuff off. The manager is continuing us some of it, but I think fair is one area for sure. Looking at the weekend of people use Metro, looking at reverse commutes. I think, Silver Line is a perfect example. I think we're seeing more and more, when people do start coming back, people are renting, buying near metro stations. They're going to be commuting out your way, and there's going to be a lot of reverse commuting on. That's something new in many ways. There's a lot of talk going on to do to come back to transit. Are in particular are talking to each other how to support people, and particularly Metro.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. I guess maybe specifically for these bullets that we're looking at, I wonder if we might be able to strengthen the last bullet a little bit, because right now it almost looks a little passive. Continue to communicate and encourage a safe return to transit to rebuild ridership. I wonder if it would be okay for everybody if maybe staff could come up with some stronger wording there to talk about more than whatever we could do to more actively encourage people to use them. Yeah, something a little more proactive. Working with partnerships across major employers and local jurisdictions, to get people using rail again, something like that. At least try to use that to be a little more proactive. And again, I don't know how much we can move the needle, probably not that much, but if even moving it, just a little bit, I think could help.
Sounds good. Mr. Meyer, if you hold on. Okay. Ms. Matthijs?
Yeah, I just, on that topic, I thought it'd be helpful. I can share that actually starting on Monday, our coordinated transit takes you where you need to go campaign, and I should have written down the exact words on it, but is actually going to be starting on WTOP, WAMU, and it's talking really about Northern Virginia transit in general, is there. I'm going to have to look up exactly what that catchphrase is because it's actually very clever and it's not coming to me right now. But we do have a 6-week marketing campaign. It's also going to be showing on Hulu and then WTOP, WAMU on the radio, as well as on their website and through social media. So I may just, I'll share that tagline later, but we are very thankful we were able to take some resources from DRPT and leverage those to do that marketing campaign. If you recall, it was initially planned as the getting folks back on transit after the summer shutdown. Obviously, we repurposed those funds, but we hope it's the beginning of a boost to talk about transit and getting folks back on.
Sounds good. Mr. Turner, did you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, and I apologize everyone for being late. I had a minor family emergency. Matt and I have talked briefly about moving operating into the capital program. And I initially was okay. We obviously don't want to do it, but I came down on the side 55-45. Yeah, if you have to, you have to. But listen to Dave tonight, and Matt again, I'm persuaded that, yeah, we don't want to do that. And if the purpose is protecting jobs, which I am sympathetic with, the overall health of the system, particularly when you've got a fairly large body of empirical evidence suggesting that we dipped into capital before, and that's what created the long-term health problems in the system, that's going to have a greater impact on jobs in the long run, in the long view. But the other thought I had was, presumably, if you shift operating expenses to capital, is it possible that's a one-way door? I was assuming that if we then got an infusion of federal money, it would replace that capital funding that we tapped, but that may be a one-way door. You may get future infusions of COVID stimulus money that specifically prohibits you from using it for capital expenses. So is it possible that once you go down that, open that door and go into capital money, that even if you get more money on the back end, you can't ever replace it with COVID money? That's the first question. Second question is, I'm assuming if we get an additional infusion of federal money on the July, December versus January through July comparison, that we would use all of that infusion money to go to the January for July austere side, rather than do anything to beef up the left side of that chart. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Mr. Meyer, did you want to jump back in, or are you good with your question?
No, I'm sort of overtaken by other comments. So we'll just leave it at, I think I made my point, and so thank you for, that's it. I don't have any other comments.
Okay. Anybody else? Let's see. So I did have one quick question, and this has been a great discussion tonight. Are there any type of milestone moments? We know March for sure is one, but any other milestone moments where we know that the board is going to have to take action, especially in regards to some of the staffing and if we have to lay people off or not. And of course, there's the whole variable of if Congress decides at some point, yeah, we're going to, infuse more money or not infuse more money. But are there, essentially what I'm looking for is are there some drop dead points on our timeline that we have to make sure that we're clearly aware of between now and December?
I think there's the budget obviously for FY 2022. Other than that, not really. There is this question about PREA funding, which is again kind of a separate issue, but I think the board has the ability to amend the budget at any point, and that's what happened with FY 21. I think it is worth mentioning that the decision's pretty much has been made to go up to that 80% service level for 21 using some of this money. So one of the arguments that some of the board members have had is, well, if we're going up to that in February, it doesn't make sense to then cut in July and then, but anyway, a lot of this that you have to, once you dive into it, there's timelines that are fairly lengthy for when you have to make notices and you're dealing with, contracts and things like that. So it's a little bit tricky to do it mid-year, but in any event, no, the board can sort of add, adjust the budget as needed as it goes along. And we did a lot of that in in the current fiscal year several times. Pretty much as soon as we adopted it in, April of last year, it was then amended several times over to adjust for, what was happening with COVID.
And I think Kanik, I think in February, end of February, beginning of March, you'll want to have remarks on budget. It would be helpful to have some of that for the public hearing. I was on a call yesterday with Senator Office Priya, and I think that's potentially, is that fair to say, Greg? Are you?
Yes, I'm still on.
That's fair to say that that's going to move pretty quickly.
Yeah, we hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it sure sounds like it, Stephanie. They're moving very quickly. So we may want to let us as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But nice to have those documents or letters in.
Yeah. Gonna hop back over here to Mr. Snyder.
Sure. Thanks. So somewhere I'm looking for more of a nuanced reflection of demand and supply than I see with we're going to go to 80%, even though the demand may be at 20%, 30%, and then we're going to drop down to 30%, where the demand may actually be up. So I'm looking for, and I know you can't, move people in right away. I know there are personnel issues, but I think for budgeting standpoint, I'm still looking for a smoother approach here. And again, my own personal experience, I rode Metro the last couple of weeks, and it was wonderful to have basically pre-pandemic service, but I'm looking around and there's 6 people on the train and nobody on the station. So, I mean, I can't justify that. And then just to fall off the cliff a few months later because the hoped for federal money didn't come in. So I don't know how you word it. It's probably something for this group to consider later on. But I'm looking for a smoother glide path than I see in the proposal so far. More of a nuanced relationship to supply and demand. And hopefully we can agree on some language about closing stations and a headway of 30 minutes. So that's kind of the comments that I have. Thanks.
Mr. Alcorn.
Thank you. I totally agree with Mr. Snyder. I think it would be, and this is tough. This is a really tough question. But it would be good to know if we did start out with 15 minutes instead of 12 during the week, and something longer on the weekend. What would that do budget-wise? I mean, I know there's the question of layoffs, but what would it do? Budget-wise, would it let us? So I think it might be helpful for the board members to have that information. So it might be something useful. And maybe for the public to have it as well, for comment purposes.
All right. So there's been a robust conversation. Staff, you guys have, did you want to give us a quick synopsis of some of the notes you guys have?
Absolutely. I will do my best, and if other NVTC staff can chime in for something I'm sure that I'll miss. I think on the second bullet, I think we'll have paragraphs eventually when we get there in the letter, but we'll try to strengthen and nuance that, sort of doing both at the same time, reflecting the conversation that we just had. Sort of similar to the third bullet, getting to Mr. Snyder's comments about a little better service on the back half there, and the sort of glide path trade-off conversation that we've discussed. And then on the last one, I think I heard strengthen, and so we'll put together some language on that. And I'm sure I missed one or two. So at this point, I will kind of pause for Kate or anyone else to jump in while I skim through my notes.
I would just add something, a bullet can be included in one, or add that really the notion of closing a large number of closing stations is just, we got to make a statement about that.
Yeah, particularly, if I could, particularly in our economic recovery phase, which is where we're going to be.
And everyone, just so you know, I mean, I think the city manager articulating that exact wants the system there, and the board does as well for the recovery. I know the governors have communicated that to us, you know, that they're ready to go. This thing starts to ramp up again. So, yeah, we're definitely well aware of that.
All right. Any last comments before I give it over to Andrew for next steps? All right, seeing none. Andrew, any next steps you want to fill us in on?
Yep. So again, reflecting the tremendous uncertainty we just discussed over this budget and items we hope to know more over the next few weeks or months. That's why we're pushing the letter off as long as possible and keeping this as thematic to let us kind of tackle some of these and get through it. So we'll reflect the discussion here in updated bullets, which we'll work with the chairman on for the February commission meeting. There is public comment period, and of course, this commission will submit a letter for that, which we'll approve at the March meeting. And your jurisdictions also are more than welcome to send letters as well. And that is also the space for sort of anything more detailed on like bus route level, things like that. That's the space for that. And then again, additional public hearings in March, and at least right now, the board, WMATA board anticipates adopting the budget in April. So a little bit of a delayed budget cycle, but that reflects the federal aid. Next slide. And with that, that's all I've got for next steps, and it's the last agenda item. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Andrew. And again, just to remind everyone, you know, and just to reiterate again, we will have several other occasions to have these discussions. But moving on to agenda item number 4, other items of jurisdictional importance, and just kind of open it up to the floor. Mr. Snyder?
Sure, just to get things started, I have more questions than anything. So I think travel patterns have changed pretty dramatically, and I assume Metro is looking particularly on the bus side about routes that just aren't performing anymore, but looking at frankly the changes in travel patterns and how we can adjust to them. For example, you may get more cross Virginia traffic and less Virginia to DC traffic, bus wise. And so I know you are, but that's an area where if you want to go regionally and you want to go really big, that is, we need to, scale back, but not to the point that it becomes unproductive for any of the participating jurisdictions. But are we looking at demand, how it's changing, and what we're doing to address the demand that is there? And I'll say where I work, the earliest that my office is at 12th and F. The earliest we're going to go back is Labor Day. The CEO has said that. And we're never going to be anywhere near the number of office workers in downtown that we were before. And a fair number of those people commuted from Virginia. So, but the trips within Virginia may be going up. So it's just a question about the capability to flex, particularly on the bus side, and what you're seeing there.
Okay. No, I agree with.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that starting to. So. This pandemic.
Any other jurisdictions? Might actually get everybody out of here early. Going once, going twice. All right. Before we adjourn, just want to remind everyone, Commission will discuss WMATA's FY22 proposed budget at the February Commission meeting. WMATA GM Paul Whitterfield will also present remarks at the March Commission meeting. And our next NVTC WMATA committee meeting has not been scheduled yet, but we will get back to everybody on that one as soon as possible. Staff, am I missing anything here?
Nope, we're good to go.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being here tonight and for the great discussion. And we got a lot of work ahead of us. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.